Facts. Yeah, facts. We tell you facts. All the facts.
All right, guys, let's learn about Margaret Atwood. I'm going to tell you some general facts as well as like some like more in-depth facts. I think Gabe has like the coolest fact in their section that I don't talk about, but it was pretty neat. Uh, but I want to thank thoughtco.com for their biography of Margaret Atwood, as it helped in filling in a lot of areas of information that both Britannica and Margaret Atwood's website did not have. Just like more context, like a lot of the shorter written informational articles about her were just like, she did this and she wrote a lot. And I was like, that's cool, but like, why did she write a lot? What was her deal? You know, like, what was
Mm-hmm.
her story that led her there? Like, it's cool that she wrote a bunch of books about stuff, but like, why did she do that? I feel like it's just interesting to learn that. So Thoughtco got more in depth about like what her life story was.
Awesome.
As I said before, Margaret Atwood has authored more than 50 books of fiction, poetry, and critical essays. That's a bunch. They wrote all the time. They are still alive, I believe, and writing more. So that's pretty awesome that, 50 is a lot of books. That's a bunch. I can't even fathom writing 50 of anything other than these scripts that are a page or two long. So it's impressive. Whole ass books. So, Margaret Atwood was born on November 18th, 1939, in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. Her parents were Margaret Atwood, Nee Kalam was her maiden name, and Carl Atwood. Her mother was a dietitian and her father was an entomologist, which is a bug scientist. And like Octavia Butler, her mother read to her quite a lot, and that's something that really influenced her love of writing and reading itself. And Atwood described her mother as a tomboy or not like fitting of traditional womanly being, which could have like influenced her a little bit too. One thing that I thought was really interesting about her mom is that she was like really a pillar of like pushing for education. And that apparently like her grandfather didn't want to pay for Margaret Atwood's mother's schooling because he called her too frivolous, which is just rude. Um, so she ended up taking a job teaching to save and pay for her own way to college. In college, she ended up meeting Margaret Atwood's father, Carl Atwood, and they got married. They spent much of their time in log cabins next to insect research labs, which Carl Atwood actually built the
Hmm.
cabins that they lived in. And they lived for many years without electricity or running water, which I thought was very interesting. Um, Apparently, her mother also got really into becoming an ice dancer and did so until he was like 70 years old. And had a lot of just like really
Nice
interesting
answer.
interests, like was just very independent, wanted to like what is it called when it snows, like shovel her own lawn. She was like always on the roof taking stuff out of the gutters and stuff. Like she was very into just like defying gender norms.
Mm-hmm.
So Margaret was like raised pretty heavily by her mother, especially because they were homeschooled until the age of 12. And lived in these cabins next to bug labs without electricity or running water. So she had like a what you could describe as a somewhat non-traditional childhood. So Margaret was the middle child. She has two siblings, and in her youth, they moved all around Canada, living in northern Ontario, Quebec, and Toronto. Atwood didn't start attending traditional schooling until the age of 12. As I said, like her mother homeschooled her until the age of 12, but she became an avid reader and writer. She read a variety of things from traditional literature to comic books, and she loved writing as much as she loved reading and wrote children's plays and stories at the age of 6.
Hmm.
She continued her schooling, moving on to high school at Leaside High School in Toronto, and they moved on to college with their undergraduate at the Victoria College at the University of Toronto, and their masters they got at Radcliffe College, which I believe is the female school for Harvard
Hmm.
in Massachusetts. Um, they almost followed that up with a PhD, but ended up not completing their dissertation. Following school, Atwood married the American writer Jim Polk, but they got divorced pretty quickly 5 years later, and they met pretty soon after and fell in love with a fellow Canadian novelist named Graham Gibson. And in 1976, they lived together until Gibson's death in 2019. So they never ended up getting married, but they did have a child together, which was their only child, Eleanor Atwood Gibson. And Margaret published her first book of poetry in 1961 called Double Persephone, which was pretty soon after or before giving birth. And she ended up publishing another book like a year after giving birth too. So in 1961, she published Double Persephone, and this book of poetry was so well received, it won an E.J. Pratt Medal, and it named Atwood one of the foremost Canadian poets of the modern era, which is like a pretty big title. Poetry made up most of Atwood's early career, where she focused more on teaching. She worked teaching at 3 Canadian universities, joining their English departments. This allowed for her to travel across Canada, where she taught English at the University of the British Columbia, Vancouver, as well as Sir George Williams University in Montreal, and finishing at the University of Alberta. So similar to her childhood, she spent a lot of her adulthood traveling, and that like continued on into her like later years of teaching, where she ended up going to like Australia and other places. Pretty interesting. So during this period of teaching, she also published 3 collections of poetry: The Kaleidoscope's Baroque, Talismans for Children, and Speeches of Dr. Frankenstein. And in 1966, she published The Circle Game, which won an award for the Governor General's Literary Award. In 1968, she published The Animals in That Country, and the first decade of her career in writing, poetry was their main focus, and they published poetry almost exclusively. But in 1969, Atwood began taking on novels and published her first novel, The Edible Woman. This was the start of Atwood covering more like societal critiques through speculative fiction. And during her journey into novel writing, she continued to teach, this time at the University of Toronto, where she became a writer in residence. A lot of her career continued as being writers in residence. She still did teach, but she ended up getting to travel a lot through being a writer in residence. In her residency, Atwood published 3 more novels known as Surfacing, which was written in 1972, The Lady Oracle in 1976, and Life Before Man in 1979. In 1973 is when she originally got divorced and soon later fell in love with Graham Gibson. Their daughter was born the same year as The Lady Oracle was published in 1976. And these novels carried similar themes as The Edible Woman and started to establish her as an author who covered themes of gender, sexual politics, and identity intersection between national and personal identity. While she pursued novels, she did continue to write poetry and gained more fame through poetry. She continued to publish 6 collections of poetry between 1970 and 1978. Her most famous book that we'll be talking about next week, The Handmaid's Tale, was published in 1985. The perspectives shown in this are very reflective of the time period it was written in. And also it was interesting, like the reality that it was before like technology and the internet. So you kind of see like the impact of that as well, and how like people just didn't know what the internet would do. So you have like, just like this different perspective on how society was thought to turn out, not even considering like how the internet would come into play and kind of like open up this like across the world situation, which I'm sure they might get into more with Works and Crake and like bringing technology more into their writing. But one thing I thought was super interesting is that in addition to being a writer, she was also an inventor, and worked on a robotic writing technology that allowed you to, like, from a remote position, sign things. And in addition to being an inventor, she kept going on with writing. Following The Handmaid's Tale, Atwood wrote Cat's Eye, which was also well received. Throughout the 1980s, Atwood continued teaching, but did hope to eventually leave teaching for a more lucrative career as a writer. Teaching did allow for her to travel more, as I said, and she was able to teach and write in New York and Australia. But in the 1990s, Atwood continued novel writing and focusing on morality and feminism, covering many topics and styles. In 1993, she published The Robber Bride, and in 1996, Alias Grace. Both novels depicted a villainous female character. Alias Grace was apparently based on a real story where a maid was convicted of murdering her boss. But both novels won awards and recognition. And at the turn of the century, we got to see her publish a little bit more technology-focused work. The The Blind Assassin won many awards and earned her a place in Canada's Walk of Fame. But as she continued, her books started to turn more towards technology and mixed with the speculative fiction as well as just like real life. So she came up with, as I said, the idea for remote writing technology that allowed a user to write in real ink from a remote location. This technology is called Long Pen, which is just fun. It's like a robot that signs things for you. I have like a picture in the blog that will go out. It's just like it looks like this kind of like cool robot thing that like will just kind of 3D print energy sign things for you so you can sign like wherever you are, and it'll, if you put it at conventions or like book tours is how she used it, where she couldn't attend in person, she would still be able to sign books through Long Pen. So it's pretty neat. As I said, in 2003, Atwood started to move more in technology. So Atwood published Orcs and Crake, which is a post-apocalyptic speculative fiction novel that turned into a trilogy called the Mad Adam Trilogy. And the trilogy follows a post-apocalyptic scenario where humans have pushed science and technology to alarming places, including genetic modification and medical experimentation. She also went on to write an opera, which is really cool. In the early 2000s called Pauline for the City Opera of Vancouver, which was about the life of a Canadian poet / performer named Pauline Johnson. Atwood's most recent work also includes some new takes on classical stories. Her 2005 novella, The Penelopiad, retells of the Odyssey and the perspective of Penelope, and Odysseus' wife specifically. And it was adapted for a theatrical production in 2007. In 2016, as a part of the Penguin Random House series of Shakespeare retellings, she published Hagseed, which reimagines the Tempest Revenge play and as the story of an outcast theater director. But Atwood's most recent work, which we talked about a little bit at the beginning that we kind of want to check out, is The Testaments from 2019. Which is a sequel to The Handmaid's Tale, much anticipated, I imagine. And the novel was one of 2 joint winners of the 2019 Booker Prize. So honestly, when I was doing a lot of this research, there was not much personal information about Margaret Atwood and her like upbringing, other than like she spent a lot of her life without technology, and like spending a lot of time outside in the woods with her dad, like following bugs, and kind of just like reading and learning about stuff in a way that's like kind of different than if you were in a public school for the majority of your educational upbringing, as well as like just in like technology surrounded upbringing. But she seemed pretty interesting. I imagine that like when, sadly, after death, I feel like a lot more personal information gets published about people. So I imagine there'll probably be a lot more in-depth biographical information about her eventually. But I couldn't find anything like too personal. So it was mostly just like, yeah, about what she did, where she's from, a little bit of her childhood. And yeah, that's the whole spiel.
Yeah, there. I think it's. I saw the Penelopiad, like listed, and I'd never heard of it before, and so I got like really excited because I'm like I really love when we take classic tales and we retell them from a different point of view. Like there's yeah. So one of my favorite like times where they've done this was with one of my favorite villains of all time, which is Iago from Othello. Only because I just love. I'm a sucker for Shakespeare. I love Shakespeare, but I love Iago because he literally just like turns to the audience like all the time, and it's just like I'm gonna start messing stuff up. I'm about to ruin this person's whole career. Like I'm gonna stir the pot. Just get ready, and then he does it. Like he just does it, and it's just chaos. So there's a book called Ayago, which is Othello but told from his point of view, and I found that really fascinating. Even the fact that like we get to see Penelope's point of view, because it's like that whole time he's out doing stuff and so much occurs for her in the the Odyssey that we don't ever see. Like he just comes back and she's like, it is so messed up right now, but I've been holding it down. And he's like, everything's better because I'm here. And she's like, no, it's not. She's like, it absolutely is not. I've been running this whole thing. So I got very excited about that.
Well, it kind of, yeah, it ties back to that whole like only certain stories have been told for a very long time, and it would be interesting to have other stories told. So I think that's like her whole spiel with trying to do that, is like trying to like focus in on different characters who have like kind of just been spoken over
Mm-hmm.
or like written about from the perspective of men,
Yeah.
and like kind of giving them a voice. So I think that's like a cool idea. So
Yeah.
it's maybe it's interesting. We'll see.
Yeah, I'm definitely gonna read it. It's on my list now. And a lot of her work has been adapted. Like *Handmaid's Tale* obviously has that show on Hulu,
Hmm.
which we haven't finished, but we've
Yeah.
definitely watched. And then it was also a movie before that. And then the *Alias Grace* was adapted for Netflix and was a TV show. I have, and I own *Robber Bride* and *The Blind Assassin*, but I have not read them yet. So
Mm,
it's just there's too many books in the world
yeah.
and
And she wrote 50 of them.
not enough to
So
yeah, 50 of her books. You
yeah.
can't expect me to be able to read them all.
Yeah.
Um,
That's what time is,
so
It's eventual.
it's so
You'll get to it.
unfortunate. Yeah. Alright, well, why don't I tell you a bit about, her work specifically and some other things about her. Um, yeah.
Do it.
Alright, so I wanna start, by, addressing some concerns.
Mhm.
Because as happens just in our lives, when you really love someone who's a creator, it is almost guaranteed
Yeah.
that they're gonna do something or say something that people are gonna show you and be like, "Is this your king? This your queen?" And you're like, "Dang it.
Yeah, they're just a
You
person
coulda
who
did." Yeah.
stuff.
So let's talk about the turf elephant in the room.
Mhm.
And so, as I've mentioned, I've always appreciated Atwood's work, and I have many of her pieces. I've read them. I've met her in person, like I said, and I understand the heartbreaking feeling you get when an idol or someone you trusted as an ally reveals themselves to be something other. Looking at you, Harry Potter fans, I feel your pain, though not
Mhm.
quite as hard because the question is Margaret Atwood a turf? There's this discussion online after she shared a Twitter article, an article on Twitter titled "Why Can't We Say Woman Anymore?" and it was anti-trans in nature,
Mm.
though not like explicit, which is like a part of the conversation. So the article claimed that the word woman was being bastardized, villainized, erased by terms like person who menstruates, which is used instead of woman who menstruates to honor transgender men and non-binary people. But according to this article, is actually erasing women. Which is not true.
Yeah.
It is just explaining it, and, um, yeah, Margaret hasn't been, like, an outright TERF like JK, but sharing this article kind of shows this passive indoctrination into trans hate or trans misinformation, transphobia, and
Yeah.
Margaret encouraged Twitter followers to read the entire article, trying to say that the writer themselves was not a TERF,
Mm.
kind of explaining their own interpretation of it, and it was more of like, um I'm not gonna make explanations for her for words into her mouth, but from what it seemed to me was like it was more of like that some issues were overshadowing women's issues in their opinion,
Mm.
which is not true. And somebody has a problem with intersectionality. So someone lacks intersectionality a lot in their work.
Yeah.
So I could see why they would think that including other people into your narrative would see that as an attack instead of like, oh, we can help each other because all these
Yeah.
issues are all tangled up in one another and we
We're
can all
not
be more
free
powerful.
if we're not all free.
We're free if we're not, like
Yeah.
anyway, later she did tweet out a scientific article that pressed the idea that gender is a construct and we shouldn't be placing folks into these boxes. And when followers pushed back about the oppression of women in Gilead, trying to say, like, you like there are people who are just like Gilead's about like women specifically. We don't talk about trans people, blah blah blah, like
Yeah.
trying to like
Well, who were like thrilled that she might be a TERF, and we're like,
yeah.
"Yay, another
Other TERFs.
author."
Other TERFs were like, "Oh, cool, see, this is your feminist icon, and she's also
Yeah.
doesn't believe that trans
And then
women are women.
when she was like, "No, but maybe not," and then they were
Yeah.
like, "What you said?
Yeah,
You were
exactly.
one of
They're like
us." Yeah.
they're like, you can't share this scientific article because you wrote this whole book that says something else." And she replied, in the novel, they had to be the people who were made handmaids had to
Mhm.
be divorced because Gilead also doesn't allow divorce and fertile or immoral, though some of them would just end up at Jezebel's.
Mhm.
And women married only once would be wives of high status or econo wives for the lower income folks. And some could choose celibacy, becoming aunts or Marthas. So, explaining that the designation of handmaiden wasn't based on gender, but these specific qualifications only, though it's kind of feels a bit like when JK is like Dumbledore is gay and everyone's like, but
Mhm.
where? Like you can't just like like you wrote the book, hun. Like you could have wrote that. You could have wrote any of these things that
In
you're
there, yeah.
retroactively saying are happening. You can't do that. Like
Yeah.
write a book, write it.
Write it down.
This is
Say it's
lies
there.
now.
Yeah.
It's just fan fiction for your own work.
Yeah.
And so that's what it kind of felt like to me because it was like, well, I didn't explicitly say that they had to be women, but it's like, but you are, like you did, like you weren't, but also the trans narrative, like those, the defense of them and the conversation pieces about trans women wasn't something that was out there. So when she wrote it in 1985 or 1984, when she wrote it, when it was published in 1985, I can understand her just not even knowing to do that.
Yeah.
It's just ignorance. So again, but she has said, like specifically about this gender issue in an article on Guardian titled Margaret Atwood on Feminism, Culture Wars, and Speaking Her Mind. I'm very willing to listen, but not to be scammed. And she has said that we should rejoice in nature's infinite variety. Everything in nature is on a bell curve. We have this two box thinking about gender because it's biblical. So wool over here, linen over there. And then she goes further to explain, okay, let me say this again. This is going to take a while to settle down, but XY and XX are not the only chromosomal combinations possible. Look it up, okay? This has been a influx for a very long time. And in the Bible, a male wearing female clothes would be, she makes a slicing gesture across her neck. You want to do that? No. Okay, so in the end, I won't defend her and say she's not a TERF because of this conversation, because she has said there's more than one gender and gender's stupid. Frankly, I'm not defending her because she needs to defend herself. Simply, she should be open to learning and hearing from the trans community now, right? We can make all the defenses about what she's written and everything else in the past, but her posting things on Twitter is actively happening now. And she has like posted since. She posted articles that mention that essentially she has no right to speak on trans issues, of which I absolutely agree. She
Mhm.
shared articles like why can't we say women anymore, is speaking out about trans issues though, whether it's intentional or not.
Yeah.
And so she needs to choose. Like, she needs to learn from the communities and not speak for them, but at least admit to her own ignorance and that she needs to unlearn some of
Yeah.
the things that like maybe passively she has like ingested, and apologize even if you didn't intend to harm the community. You did. Impact
Yeah.
over intention, which we're always talking about. So say sorry, learn about the issues, and then let's move on.
Yeah.
I will say that her limited, white, uneducated about trans issues brand of feminism certainly affects her work. And we'll talk about this more, this insular POV, next week when we compare her titular work, Handmaid's Tale, to something more worldly like Octavia Butler's Parable of the Talents.
Yeah.
So stay tuned. However, this week I want to focus on her work specifically, her influences and motivations. So that's out of the way.
Yeah.
I'm going to let her deal with that.